Dr. Ryan Burns. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Geography. And this is the 4th year of the Social Justice in the Smart City Working Group, graciously funded by the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. And we've been delighted to work with them over 4 years. It's a really, really great institute on campus doing some really funding and supporting a really amazing amount of work and quality work. Hi, Ben.
Hello.
So this is the Social Justice in the Smart City Working Group. One of the things that has really animated the 4 years of conversations that we've been having is, what do we mean? So with the growing integration of digital technologies into the urban fabric for purposes of planning and administration and so on, what sorts of new challenges, opportunities, and practices and processes are raised in this new context that necessitate we revisit sometimes old and sometimes new, but more longstanding concerns around social justice in the city. Now, the main intellectual tradition that we're coming from is therefore drawing on people like David Harvey, who, we're obviously banking on by using the phrase social justice in the smart city, referencing his book, Social Justice in the City. But also lately we've been talking a lot about people like Nancy Fraser and Iris Marion Young and John Rawls and a lot of other people who are also key voices in the more longstanding philosophical tradition of social justice. And so for the 4 years that we've been doing this, we've been gathering people together to have these conversations about, what do we mean by social justice in the smart city? How do we pursue it? What does that pursuit look like? What does the social justice itself look like? And what are the best ways to do that or not to do it? And so we're delighted to be welcoming here Ben Green from University of Michigan. And so to introduce Ben, we have Joyce Purcell, a PhD student in the Department of Geography here. I'll just go ahead and let you take over.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. We are very lucky to have Dr. Ben Green with us today and his talk on the Smart Enough City. He is a postdoctoral scholar with the Michigan Society of Fellows and an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. He recently received his PhD from Harvard in applied mathematics with a secondary focus on science and technology studies. Currently, his research focuses on the social and policy impacts of data science, algorithmic urban governance, and algorithmic fairness. And as I mentioned today, his talk is going to focus on work from his recent book, The Smart Enough City, Putting Technology in Its Place to Reclaim Our Urban Future. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ben Green.
Great. Joyce, thank you for the intro, and thanks to Ryan and everyone who helped to organize this. Oh wow, it has just started to absolutely sort of crazy downpour outside the window. So I will share some slides, give a talk about the book and some of my more recent work if we have time for it, and then we'll open up after that for questions, discussion, critique, whatever the audience, whatever you all want to do. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you all about my book, The Smart Enough City, which was published last spring by MIT Press. And it really brings together a couple of different strands of my work. During my time as a PhD student in computer science, really thinking about and some of my work before that as a data scientist, really thinking about the role of technology and its opportunities in local government, alongside also a variety of legal and policy related work, thinking about the sort of the broader social implications of technology, drawing on the legal implications, drawing on science and technology studies to think about how smart city technology is affecting cities from that perspective, as well as time that I have spent actually working inside local government, most notably a year inside the city of Boston as a data scientist, really seeing the ways in which technology and data are actually being used on the ground, and the ways in which they are made useful in often surprising in surprising ways that are quite different from what you might think about from a corporate perspective or from a sort of academic, technical, engineering perspective. So just as an overview of the talk, I'll start by sort of describing this idea of smart cities around the theme of technology as the solution. I'll then turn to sort of summarizing my main critiques of the smart city and really the limits of technology as a tool for social change under the banner largely of this idea introduced of tech goggles. I'll then turn to how we might start to think about using technology well, which is the central sort of theme of my book around smart enough cities as an alternative to smart cities. And then finally, I will describe, time permitting, some thoughts on paths forward, some of my more recent work developing a theory I call algorithmic realism around how we can start to actually develop, implement, and govern algorithmic technologies more thoughtfully and responsibly with an eye towards social impact, social justice, and public policy. So just to start with a brief overview of smart cities, although most people are likely familiar, just to sort of get all on the same page of where at least how I'm approaching the topic. So I like this definition as a pretty good encapsulation of what we mean when we talk about smart cities. The language from Cisco says, smart cities are those that integrate information communications technology across 3 or more functional areas. A smart city is one that combines traditional infrastructure, roads, buildings, and so on with technology to enrich the lives of its citizens. So this sort of captures the idea that a smart city is really about integrating new forms of digital technology, here described as sort of ICT, information communications technology, into existing and traditional city operations, services, infrastructure, governance. So what we really have is this idea of smart as this modifier that is referring to the use and implementation of these types of digital technologies. And what this looks like, this really entails a wide range of technologies. There's not sort of a singular suite of, this is what it means to be a smart city, but it sort of entails, depending on the particular instance, a variety of technologies, which include sensors, often described as IoT or Internet of Things, that are placed throughout the city to try to understand and track urban conditions. Self-driving cars and other forms of smart mobility are quite common. Uses of data and analytics for algorithms, prediction, trying to summarize, categorize, forecast conditions within the city is another very common area. And finally, various types of mobile applications, forms of connectivity, forms often around civic engagement or public services, or often known as digital services. So these are sort of just a quick range of the types of technologies that often fall under the banner of smart cities that different governments will employ under this approach, or different technology companies will share under this language of smart cities. And of course, smart cities are not merely some pipe dream of a couple technologists. It really, in the 2010s, emerged as a pretty dominant vision for what the future of urban spaces will look like, what the future of municipal governance looks like, and with a particular vision of this is what we are going to do to bring progress to our cities. And so we have huge investments from federal governments around the world, from major technology companies, including IBM and Cisco and Siemens, various more local coalitions of cities and urban leaders, and of course, lots of discussion of the topic in the mainstream press. So smart cities were not just a interesting thought project or experiment, but really was or has become a relatively widespread vision of what our future cities are going to look like and how they're going to be governed. And so I think this makes it incredibly important that we take a thoughtful and critical look at what this is, not just as some interesting technological projects, but really as a relatively broad and almost comprehensive vision for the future of urban life. So to turn now to what I see as the limits of this vision, I want to introduce one of the central ideas from my book, which is technology goggles, which is sort of a term that I came up with to describe the particular way that people, particularly engineers, but often those who are sort of susceptible or influenced by an engineering mindset, come to see the world and see the role of technology in solving social problems. So, and I just would say that tech goggles really includes two core beliefs or myths. The first being that technology drives social change. In other words, that the way that we achieve progress in our societies is through technologies, through the development and use of new and better and more sophisticated technologies. And this is a relatively standard belief in technological determinism, that technology is this naturally evolving and created force that is gonna be a major driver for social progress. And then in particular, that what technology provides is neutral and objective solutions to social problems. So the belief is not just that technology is driving social change, but that it's always a desirable social change, that technology is this appropriate way of removing us from the tricky discussions and fights about politics into a more neutral landscape where we can just think about improving technology and improving our societies. And I guess what I would describe the view of tech goggles as is a way of looking at the world and what is and it really shapes what is perceived. What one sees are only those elements of social problems that can be solved by technology, such that technology solutions are then proposed as the remedy for those types of problems. So it's not just not just that technology is proposed as the solution, but really that it shapes the understanding of what these problems are in the first place, such that technology is seen as an appropriate solution. So what this leads to is, as an interesting example of this, I like to show this simulation of self-driving cars in a future city that doesn't need any streetlights. So this was a simulation put forward by a group of scientists and engineers showing how we can, with automated vehicles, we could get rid of traffic lights and drastically reduce congestion by having this sort of slot system where cars can just zoom through the intersections. And on first glance, this looks pretty great. There's certainly no congestion, and the researchers put this side by side where you have, cars stopping at the red lights inefficiently and all of that. But on closer glance, what we see is that this doesn't really look like a city at all. Although we do have the painted crosswalks, there's no sense that there are pedestrians in this city. There's no sense that there are, people on bikes, buses, that really there's anything at all in this city that is actually worth considering it a city, as opposed to any sort of abstract intersection or even a highway interchange, outside the city. And what's particularly remarkable about this simulation is that it's not just meant to be an abstract intersection, but actually is meant to depict a specific intersection in downtown Boston, which looks like this. So it looks completely different if you actually go out there. This was, just a typical Saturday afternoon at this exact intersection in downtown Boston, where you see obviously pedestrians. At every light, you'll see tons of cyclists going through. This is along some of the most busy and important bus routes in the city of Boston, as well as many other elements of the urban fabric that take place here. So what we see is that all of this all of these elements of the city were completely abstracted away in order to turn this into a very one-dimensional ecosystem and problem, where we could think about traffic as the sole problem in this context, and cars operating without anyone else. And therefore, we could create this almost perfectly optimized system because we had removed everything else from the equation. So in other words, I like to think of technology goggles as creating this sense of distortion, where we are looking at a complex urban ecosystem, and what we see is we sort of see that setting through the lens of a computer. And this image on the right is actually from the proposal that Sidewalk Labs, which we'll talk about sort of throughout, but Sidewalk Labs is a Google affiliated company that embarked on a major project with the city of Toronto. And this is one of the images from that, from their proposal to the city. And what we can see, although not meant to represent the exact picture I have here side by side with it, but you can sort of see this idea of really the tech goggles view. This is almost a too perfect manifestation of it, where we're seeing an urban street and sort of characterizing it through this lens of the computer. And just as a small aside for this audience, I talk a little bit in the book about how there are interesting parallels between this way of seeing the world through tech goggles and prior sort of utopian technology or more scientific based ways of perceiving of utopian futuristic cities. So where in the 20th century, we had planners like Le Corbusier, who had a very particular top-down vision of urban planning, often extolling the virtues of the view from the airplane, such that sort of leading to that sense of top-down view from above order. We now have a sort of parallel manifestation where our view is no longer from above from an airplane, but from a digital device, from a computer, or from a simulation. So what does this actually then mean in practice? What are some of the issues that arise through this vision? And to me, the most fundamental issue is that it leads to highly narrow approaches to reform as these technologies are put into place. And I think of it along sort of two levels. The first is that almost all of the technological solutions that are proposed in smart cities are not actually able to accomplish the goals that they are setting out to achieve, but also they're often making those problems, the sort of actual real problems, worse because they are derived from a fundamental misunderstanding of what that problem is or what various issues are at play in the first place. So this connects back to that distortion from tech goggles. And we can see sort of, I've already described this in the context of mobility and public transit, where from a tech goggles perspective, what we see is, we look at traffic and mobility, and we want to turn that into a very stripped down problem of optimizing the flow of vehicles. And from that perspective, automated vehicles or self-driving cars seem like a great solution because they can be more efficient than people, they can potentially go faster, don't necessarily need to have parking downtown, all of these potential benefits, which could, somewhat optimize the flow of traffic. And so we can see sort of the two issues at play here. So the first is that if you actually look at some of the dynamics of traffic and urban planning, I think it's highly unlikely that the widespread deployment of self-driving cars in place of human-driven cars would actually lead to the types of benefits that are being proposed. But more importantly, it's sort of taking this very narrow approach to saying we have this existing system of traffic and urban planning, and we can simply try to optimize or make slightly more efficient the system that we have, almost moving us away or having us start to backtrack from the increasing view in urban design and urban planning that's much less automobile centric, really trying to turn away from the car dominated models of the last century towards other types of ways of organizing our living patterns and our mobility patterns. And we can see a similar, I describe a similar pattern in policing, where we have technologies such as body cameras and predictive policing algorithms that are intended as ways to slightly make a little bit more objective systems of policing, often seeing the and sort of misconceiving the problems in policing and criminal justice as slight problems of human level implicit biases or failure to properly know when and where crime is likely to occur. And these proposals end up simply providing a very narrow approach to tinkering around the edges of these types of problems and failing to address the larger systemic issues that are at play, and often cutting against and making it more difficult for those types of larger systemic reforms to sort of be on the table and carry momentum, because we often see the technology reforms as being more substantial than they actually are. And then all of this connects to a broader reshaping of urban power and urban politics. And I often think that, there's this discourse around smart cities, creating these radically new urban lives. And I often tend to agree with that language, but not for the reason that it's proposed. The typical line would be that smart cities are going to create these wonderful utopian urban spaces and reshape things in that way. And I think what we really have is a reshaping of who is in control of the city, what types of urban democracy do we have. So I think we are smart cities do bring us to the precipice of this radical transformation, but of a very different sort than is advertised. So two elements here that are particularly important to highlight, and certainly there's lots of interplay between these two things. They're by no means distinct, but one is surveillance, the massive expansion of data and information and footage that is collected about people in the city as part of these programs. Certainly, most of the smart city projects really rely on analytics on data. So collecting data about patterns in the city, about people in the city. And what this means is that there's massive amounts of new opportunities, both for private companies as well as public agencies, and particularly law enforcement, to come in and gain access to new forms of surveillance. And I think, so one relatively recent case study that I've been following over the last year is in San Diego, which this is a picture on the left here of one of the smart streetlights that San Diego implemented in a partnership with GE, General Electric, around 2016 or 2017. And the pitch was that these technologies would be able to collect huge amounts of data about traffic patterns in the city, and that this information would lead to civic engagement, civic innovation, and the reduction of traffic. And several years later, starting around 2019, what became clear was that none of this had come to pass. None of the actual benefits had come about from the technology, but instead, I think much of the data and really the video footage from the cameras on these sensors was increasingly being used by the local police department to aid investigations, even over this past summer during the Black Lives Matter protests, to spy on those protests or to surveil and potentially, identify individuals in that manner. And so what we have is this technology that's put in place for a seemingly benign reason, the technology not actually being able to accomplish what it wants to accomplish, because it sort of just thinks you can collect the data and solve the problem without really thinking about many of the other elements behind that problem. And then that data actually just sort of being sucked into the gravity or the black hole that is law enforcement's sort of pull for data and new forms of information and control over the public. And so connecting to all of this is also the very significant threat of privatization, because so much of smart city projects and smart city technology really comes through technology companies and public-private partnerships with these companies. A notable example of this that I'm sure many of you have followed over the last couple of years was the Sidewalk Labs project in Toronto, where Sidewalk Labs was sort of outsourced to develop this neighborhood, or sort of a parcel of land, about 12 acres on the Toronto waterfront, called Quayside. And Sidewalk had really been developing this vision of, they describe it as developing a city from the internet up. This sort of, if you could just start completely from scratch, if you were untethered by the past, you could create these incredible cities because there would be technology built into every element of the infrastructure. But what was involved in this plan was pretty much allowing Sidewalk Labs to do that. And this raised not just massive questions about privacy and surveillance, although those were very much front and center in the initial debates after this project was announced, given that this was essentially Google coming in to develop a city neighborhood, but also questions about privatization. How much control would Sidewalk Labs actually be allowed to have? They were proposing incredible amounts of decision-making authority. There were weird claims about trying to gain access to some of the tax revenue from these neighborhoods. So there was really this specter of handing over incredible amounts of not just data and not just money, but also sort of governance and control of this, of a city, into the hands of a company like Sidewalk Labs. So with all that said, now I want to turn to thinking about what's an alternative vision. How can we start to think about other models for how we might use technology or think about technology in different ways in the context of cities? And what I introduced here is, in contrast to smart cities, this idea of smart enough cities, where when we think about smart cities, what we really have is, as I described at the very beginning, this modifier smart, really emphasizing the use and the role of technology. And so once you're in the once you're in the language of talking about smart cities, you're really captured in this dimension of the only way to be smarter is to have more technology or more sophisticated technology. And so if we take that use of the word smart, what we really want to think about is, what are we actually trying to accomplish? How can we move from seeing technology as this thing that we need to have in and of itself to a tool that in some cases may be useful and appropriate and in others will not? And so this idea of smart enough cities is meant to create that type of almost epistemic shift, really raising this question of smart enough for what? When we think about, as we put that modifier enough in, we have to start to think about what are we actually trying to accomplish, and how can we start to think about technology less as an end in itself, and to me, really more as a process, where smart enough is really a mindset around how we might approach the use and the role of technology in cities, viewing it much more as a tool as opposed to sort of putting it front and center as the goal. So I'll talk through a couple of examples of this and sort of the design or guiding principles of this approach that I developed throughout the book. So the first three, I think, go nicely together. Number one, address complex problems rather than solve artificially simple ones. Number two, implement technology to address social needs and advance policy. And number three, prioritize innovative policy and program reforms above innovative technology. So all of these speak to the need really to get rid of the tech goggles mindset that enforces artificial simplicity and solutionism, and instead to start to engage in different ways with integrating technological reforms with other types of policy and social change. And in the book, I describe a number of different examples of what these types of principles can look like in practice. And I'll talk through two examples of this approach. One comes from my time working as a data scientist for the city of Boston, where the goal, one of the projects that I was put on was to help the emergency medical services, the ambulances, respond more efficiently to 911 calls. There had been a gradual increase in calls coming into the department over many years without the number of units or ambulances and EMTs actually keeping up. And so I was supposed to come in and help to increase the efficiency of our responses. But as what I went and I began to actually go talk to the department, look at some of the data, and also spend time in an ambulance on a ride along, getting a feel for what these types of interactions look like, what the processes actually look like in practice. And what became clear through this research process, because I was able to not just immediately go look at the data, but actually talk to the leadership of the EMS and to get a better sense for these issues, to see that what really we had was not a problem of efficiency or inefficiency, where we just had to respond more appropriately or optimize the dispatch system. What we actually had was a problem of mismatched service delivery and service need, where a significant number of the calls that were coming in were related to growing issues around homelessness, drug addiction, and mental illness in the city. And yet the service that we were providing of sending out EMTs and an ambulance was actually not the right response, because what these individuals needed in the vast majority of cases was not acute medical care or a trip to the local hospital, but connection to social workers, connection to services, various forms of treatment. And so by seeing this, we could shift the frame from thinking about purely efficiency and thinking instead about how does our policy, how are our policies falling short, and how can we reform these policies to do a better job? Over the course of this year, we actually developed a new team within the department that was specially trained and specially focused on responding to these types of incidents, and had special training and had the right connections to better connect people to the types of social services, shelters, clinics, all of that they might need. So rather than simply optimizing the existing policy that we had, we ended up creating a new policy, a new type of approach, and advancing that and enhancing the use of that new policy through the information provided by analyzing about several years worth of data about these programs. Another example that I write about in the book comes from the city of Columbus, Ohio, which won the Smart City Challenge, which was run by the United States Department of Transportation around 2016, 2017. And what was notable about the Columbus pitch for this Smart City Challenge, which was really about sort of re-envisioning the mobility system or the mobility vision for a particular city, the DOT was going to give about $40 million to the winning city. And what was notable about the plan in Columbus was that it really put technology in the background in the service of issues related to income inequality and a lack of healthcare, particularly pre and postnatal healthcare, concerned around issues of infant mortality. So what they found was, so what was interesting about the approach in Columbus was a couple of things. Number one, they were very much had already developed a relatively long-term vision around urban planning, around what they wanted to look like, even before this challenge came out. They had put together a vision for 2030 or 2050 that was really trying to move away from a history of relatively sprawling new development and towards more dense mixed use urban development. So they had this much longer term strategy. They had begun putting programs in place for dealing with healthcare and inequality in particular neighborhoods, the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in this city. And then after they won the challenge, they actually put together a team that really went out and looked at the complex realities behind these types of problems, not just saying, oh, automated vehicles will solve the problem, or oh, this app will solve the problem, but actually going out, talking to the residents in these neighborhoods, trying to understand their issues with access to healthcare, their issues with access to employment, and began to see that from that complex understanding, they were able to develop a much more sort of nuanced range of technologies that targeted specific elements, ranging from better access to Wi-Fi, better ways of integrating information about the transit system, and a sort of rideshare system so that people could have better access to job interviews and healthcare. So a variety of very interesting technology applications that were integrated into a much longer term strategy that was oriented initially around policy towards these longer term policy goals, integrating technology into that to help solve or address some of these problems. What's also interesting about this example in Columbus is sort of where it's gone over the last couple of years since I was writing about it. And although I haven't followed it as closely, my understanding is that some of these more ambitious social equity oriented programs have ended up getting much less attention and have often seemed to have fallen by the wayside as other more traditional types of smart city projects have continued on. And so I think this, that this raises is both the some of the, really positive to me, interesting story of how a city can pursue reform with technology in a novel and creative way that centers equity, but also the challenges of doing that, not just in a plan, not just in a pilot, but actually in a sustained ongoing way, when so much of the incentives in technology, in smart cities discourse, even in just city government itself, with or without regard to technology, often push against a sustained commitment to those programs and towards some of these more traditional smart city shiny solutions that are much more oriented towards the press and towards economic development in a very different sense. So I'll turn now to the last two principles that I described. Number 4, ensuring that technology's design and implementation promote democratic values. And number 5, developing capacities and processes for using data within municipal departments. So these get at some of the other elements of how to think about technology in cities. I've already talked quite a bit about the issues of surveillance and privatization, which really connect to this issue, this 4th principle. One more example of what this looks like is actually a lot of the most interesting initiatives around democratization of technology have really come from outside of city governments, from activists and organizers and advocacy groups pushing for different types of oversight and prevention of technology. Just one example of this, as this map of the United States shows, is the development of various types of legislation meant to provide oversight, public oversight and control over police surveillance technology. And then this last principle, number 5, is really thinking about what are the ways that data can actually be useful in practice, and how does that differ from a vision of technology that often is really just thinking about how to have the smartest or most sophisticated technology. And I talk in the book about the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics in New York City. And I think that this pyramid that they have sort of nicely summarizes some of the key elements of what it actually takes to use data effectively in government, something that I spent a lot of time thinking about when I was in Boston. But they sort of describe it in these three categories. First is data management, organizing data and sort of organizing it, creating high quality data, all of those sorts of things. Moving to decision support, just actually activating the data that is there to make it accessible for people, teaching staff and leadership within the city how to use data rigorously and appropriately and use that to inform their decisions without becoming narrowly fixated on particular metrics that may not actually get at the heart of what they're trying to do. And then finally getting towards operational analytics that might use data science or machine learning to help inform decisions. And this is a really big distinction from how a lot of city sort of vendors and technologists talk about it, which is all about having the most sophisticated AI to, operationalize and manage everything throughout the city, when there's actually these other elements of management and support that are absolutely fundamental and really are prerequisites to actually being able to accomplish any of these other things. And it's much more about integrating the opportunities and affordances of data and data science into the existing bureaucratic and institutional settings that are in play, and finding new ways to find a valuable synergy between these two. So to sort of wrap up this section of the talk, there are a lot of interesting elements that I see sort of since the book has come out, thinking about sort of where smart cities go from here. And there are a couple dimensions in which I see sort of an interesting crossroads of smart cities, or a sense of uncertainty around what this idea of smart cities is going to look like in the future, what types of visions around technology and urbanism are going to play out. So one dimension of this is around private control, which, as I've described, is one of the central tension points around smart cities. And on the one hand, we see sort of major wins in terms of sidewalk labs pulling out of the city and other efforts where increased scrutiny has really pushed back on various types of public-private partnerships in smart cities. But we still see incredible amounts of private investment in urban technology. So even just a few months after Sidewalk Labs pulled out of Toronto, they introduced another one of their projects or companies called Delve, a machine learning tool for optimizing development plans. And it's a little unclear what this is intended for, but I can see incredible amounts of application for this type of system for developers who are trying to think about, how they might maximize their revenue from a housing development or a retail development or things like that. And so I could imagine seeing a shift from these sorts of large-scale smart city projects like we had in Toronto towards almost sort of smart cities as a service, where you have a company like Sidewalk Labs a little bit more behind the scenes, but helping venture capitalists or investments or real estate companies just assert more control or gain more revenue over their projects in urban spaces. So that's one dimension. The second are major questions of governance. We have, on the one hand, smart city teams and initiatives in cities that have really overreached. And on the other hand, massive amounts of public unrest and pushback against those types of systems. And so what does it look like for cities to be approaching technology, governance, and deployment in the future? We had one very ambitious attempt in New York to create an automated decision system oversight that, as described by my colleague Rashida Richardson in this report, Confronting Black Boxes, fell short in all sorts of ways, not just for technical reasons, but really because there were significant amounts of obstruction from the New York City government. Interesting, more recent sort of facial recognition bans that seem to be an interesting it was actually coming a little bit more on this telling from Wired from inside the smart city team in Portland itself. So an interesting sense of, are we able to think about how the internal teams in cities thinking about technology can more effectively, understand the limits and harms and not simply be trying to promote a very particular notion of technological innovation at the expense of everything else. And I often think of the mayor's office of new urban mechanics in Boston as one of the first and continue to be one of the leading groups or sort of city teams thinking about this intersection of technology and urban life in an incredibly thoughtful way. And then finally, these intersections of policing, surveillance, and austerity really responding to the sort of the combination of massive protests against police brutality and the COVID pandemic over the past, that have really risen up over the past sort of 6 to 9 months, say. Because on the one hand, we have this increasing view, we are getting more skeptical of technology, starting to move away from particular neoliberal logics around technology. But at the same time, I see this sort of the pandemic and all of these elements shifting us back in a different direction where we're potentially going to move into a new era of heightened austerity with budget cuts and concern about resources that could resemble the mode of austerity that we had following the financial crisis a decade ago, that in many ways created the type of logic that led to the conditions that our current vision of smart city-ness was created in. And at the same time, in response to discussions about police reform, will we simply replace existing models of policing or defund policing in a way that simply makes their reach a little less visible, but replaces it with new forms of surveillance, with new types of data collection, surveillance systems that will seemingly reduce the reach of policing, but actually sort of just turn it into a more digital form without addressing any of the underlying issues. Or instead, as I wrote with a couple of colleagues in an op-ed in the spring, can we begin to see some of the false trade-offs between ideas like privacy versus public health when it comes to contact tracing, and begin to look not at just the technology itself, but also the institutional contexts and governance mechanisms that we have when thinking about technology and putting it into the context of this broader political economy. So that sort of brings us to the end of the book and sort of where it takes us up today. And I think for maybe just a very brief period, just a couple of minutes before wrapping up, I'll connect this to some of my more recent work, thinking specifically about where we might move forward in deploying algorithms and algorithmic governance effectively in urban settings, really developing a little bit more further some of these ideas that I started out with in the book under this banner that I describe as algorithmic realism. So I think what we're really seeing, I'll sort of skip over some of the core elements of where this is coming from, but just to highlight some of the ways that, so this is really in many ways a continuation of what are these principles that I describe with regard to smart cities look like? What does this idea of smart enough look like? How can we begin to move that a little bit more with some theoretical grounding and towards a little bit more of a practically oriented method? So I sort of think about, in contrast to this idea of a very formalist view of the world that sort of connects to tech goggles, this idea of algorithmic formalism that's very aligned with the idea of tech goggles, to thinking about algorithmic realism, where first we're shifting from this idea of tech algorithms as objective and neutral to understanding them as political tools, not just value laden in themselves, but also tools of shaping political reform or tools of political action that are actually shaping the policy landscape in a variety of complex ways. So we can begin to think about what types of reforms are appropriate. If we're operating in a specific context, the first place to really start if we're trying to make change is to actually start with theories of change. What types of reforms are appropriate? What is a theory of social and political change? And to me, this really can move away from what we often have in the context of smart cities and computer science, of this idea of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There's often in smart cities this sort of false choice between the smart city where we have technology and the dumb city where we've done nothing. This idea that it's either have a smart city with technology, and if you don't like that, you're just advocating to do nothing, or this binary choice between incremental reforms, which are practical, and radical reforms, which are simply idealist, pie in the sky type dreaming. But I think by actually starting with an understanding of what types of reform are appropriate, what is a theory of change, we can begin to think more rigorously about, I like to think about really breaking that binary between radical and incremental and thinking about different strategies of incremental reforms. There are many different ways of thinking about this, and sort of a lot of writers and thinkers who align and or overlap in certain ways. But I like one framework from Andre Gortz describing the idea of reformist reforms versus non-reformist reforms. So we can think that many different types of things might be various types of incremental reforms, but some are, and typically these are the more technological ones, reformist reforms that are simply upholding or optimizing existing systems, and non-reformist reforms that are actually reshaping the types of systems we have around a more comprehensive vision of a more just and equitable society. So that can really be a starting point. Second is moving from this idea of technology as this sort of universal language, something that where we can just abstract our understandings of society into a universal mathematical formalism, into a view that's much more contextual about understanding particular types of social problems and social issues. Here, I think about starting to think about the alignment between potential technological solutions or technological applications of a variety of sorts and the types of social change that we might be trying to produce in a certain setting. And here, sort of an extension of the idea of smart enough, I introduced this idea of algorithmic agnosticism, or just being agnostic to whether or not we actually use technology at all. Approaching algorithms instrumentally, prioritizing the social impacts of reform, regardless of the role played by algorithms. So we can be putting first and foremost, not this idea of being smart and having technology, but this idea of what are we trying to accomplish here, and can we just be sort of rigorously agnostic about understanding will technology be effective or not, but whether or not it has a role is totally has no sort of normative valence aside for if it will help us actually better achieve our goals. And finally, starting to think towards implementation, moving from an internalist view that, again, only thinks about the sort of technological elements of these reforms, that starts to be more porous and can better account for many other considerations that become relevant when you're actually integrating technology into a social or political context. And I think here about a lot of my time I spend thinking about indeterminacy around technological interventions, where we might put in a technology or an algorithm into a policy setting, thinking it will have one impact. And what we actually find is that once it's in practice, it has a very different impact in practice because of the way that people are responding to it and the way that other types of policy debates are shaped or affected by the use of this tool. And so starting to think about, rather than seeing these as purely unpredictable outcomes, how can we better think about testing and accounting for indeterminacy? And some of my other work is really building out experimental modes of looking at algorithmic decision making, not just in the context of a technical prediction, but actually in a socio-technical context of how people are making sense of and responding to these predictions when making decisions. So collectively, I see these sort of realist attributes and modes of thinking as ways of adapting the methods of technological design and implementation to better question unjust social conditions, more broadly uphold a variety of goals and values, and being agnostic into the role of technology, and better account for sources of unexpected indeterminacy when actually implementing these systems. So with that, I'll wrap up. Want to thank you all for the time, and would love to hear any thoughts or questions or discussion about smart cities or anything else related to all of this that I've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was really interesting and very illuminating. And I like that that you gave a lot of material that didn't actually make it into the book too. So that gave us some new material if you've managed to read it cover to cover. We're gonna we have a Q&A box. So for all of you in the audience here, we have a Q&A down at the bottom where you can submit questions and answers. Why don't we already have one here. Our friend Kyle up in University of Alberta is asking a question here. And actually Crystal just dropped one in here too. So we'll just go through these one by one, and everyone who's listening, feel free to drop in more questions over there. Kyle's asking, can you speak more to what about smart enough cities fosters democracy? What is it about them that fosters greater democracy? And can you give an example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And what I would say, and I think, maybe this is just a difference in the wording. What I would say is that it's not simply that, okay, the smart enough city itself is fostering democracy. I really see the smart enough city less as a sort of defined thing in the way that we talk about smart cities often, but more as a process or a way of approaching the role of technology in cities. So what I think what that means though in relation to tech, it sort of has more, so I think that approach of smart enough cities then has more affordances for more democratic ways of thinking about or governing technology, where in particular, we're able to have more openness around what types of voices are in this technology. When we talk about smart cities and we're just thinking about technology, often the conversations become incredibly closed off, hard for anyone. I mean, in many cases, even inside the sort of public, inside the public agencies, people often don't even have decision-making power, can even get outsourced out to the tech company vendors themselves. So I think of it as, really, it's about the smart enough city, I think enables us to place the value of democracy front and center when we're talking about technology, that recognizing it as a form of authority or technology as a form of authority, and that we have to be able to come up with better ways of regulating and overseeing this technology. And I think, things like the facial recognition bans or surveillance oversight ordinances are important examples of that. And I think are interesting and valuable also because they sort of do cut against this idea of we just have to have more technology and we have to embrace it as quickly as possible. But being able to say that the value here is not to have technology, the value here is to ensure democratic decision-making or democratic standing in how we are making decisions about technology. So I think that's incredibly valuable. And I think, I talk in the book about being, again, skeptical of, I think a lot of the smart city rhetoric has a very simplified notion of what it means to foster democracy. I talk a bit about ideas around 311 and civic engagement applications, which have a particular sort of tech goggles understanding of democracy that says if you just put more people in communication with each other, or you can just put, give people access to get direct feedback or direct services from their government when they submit a pothole request or something, that we need to understand democracy as much more expansive than that, and not sort of put forward these types of very minimal solutions. So yeah, that's sort of a first pass answer on some of the many interesting intersections around democracy here.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned in the book that I picked up on that I liked a lot was that that the 311 and a lot of just in general smart city programs conceptualize democracy as a transaction. That it's really just about facilitating the exchange of information. That is seen when you have tech goggles on, seen to be democratic, and I think we in the university have some space to step back and think very critically about any claim that a packaged idea is going to help foster democracy, especially when it's somebody trying to sell it to us quite literally. So if smart cities are claiming, we read Ben Green's book. We're no longer developing. We're no longer delivering smart cities. We're delivering smart enough cities, because we help foster democracy. I think we'd have to think very, very carefully about that and approach it with a lot of caution. The bigger context to those transactions is oftentimes what's important. The fact that there's an uneven distribution of data production, data consumption, all kinds of things. You need, I guess what I'm getting at is you need to question what exactly do you mean by democracy as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll go on to the next question here. Crystal is asking, with the modifier enough, you point to the importance of language in reconceptualizing the role of technology. Have you come across or do you propose other words that you think play a similar role? And P.S., when you're working on something and you happen to see a talk that intersects perfectly and helps you keep going, that is what you've done for me today. Thank you. Oh, that's nice.
Oh, thank you, Crystal. Glad to hear that you were able to find some resonance with my talk and your own work. Yeah, we had an interesting discussion this morning with some of us about sort of the role of these words and the language games around them. And I both sort of find myself on the one hand thinking that they're incredibly important and also wanting to sort of be skeptical at the same time of how important they ultimately are. And yeah, I don't know that I would say that I sort of come across other words, and I don't really want to be, if anything, sort of my broader view is that we should move away from, trying to sort of have almost like a branding language around the city, that we need to have a singular word or phrase around cities. And so in some ways, smart enough is a way to start to move away from that, while also ultimately, I personally want to move away from sort of trying to reclaim smart in other ways to mean sort of to slightly say, we need smart citizens or smart policy or something like that, because I think, some of these terms, such as smart in this case, and in other contexts, I think about ethics in the context of AI, and I think in both cases these words are so heavily dominated by the technological sort of technology companies and that discourse that it's really hard to simply reclaim them. And I'd rather actually shift away from relying on those words, because it's so hard to sort of push back on the sort of common understanding that comes to take hold. So that's sort of what I would say there. I don't have other sort of direct terms that I think are playing that role. So yeah, I also tend probably not to think in that register all the time.
Thanks, Ben. Next question here. I'm interested to hear your where you take this. Ryan says, in your opinion, what role does technology play in developing third world cities or countries, how can technologies help to develop them and reduce social disparities earlier instead of after the fact? One thing I might add to this is that a lot of these conversations do orient around the global north, and that's one of the we do have a project ongoing here that tries to do what we call provincializing smart cities language and research. And so, you know, insofar as our thinking develops from the global northern philosophical traditions, we might be in a lot of ways reproducing those epistemological inequalities. So maybe I'll just tack that on to the question as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's, it's a great question, and your addition, Ryan, is important, and I think that my own work is subject to that issue of sort of being very focused on really just mostly the United States and sort of those types of thinkers and scholars. So, I've tended not, in part just because that's, I've tended not to sort of look so in as much detail at sort of the global perspective on smart cities. But, it's interesting on a number of levels where, on the one hand, some of the developing countries are taking sort of the most sort of create a smart city from the bottom up, where you have literally, in India and China, sort of cities that are springing up out of nowhere that are entire cities, not just 12 acres like we had in Toronto, but entire cities that are developed in a matter of years as smart cities. And I think it also raises, almost to the very beginning of my talk, where I described the sort of various range of technologies that are at play in the smart city, and in some ways that sort of set of technologies are really particular to the context of the United States, although some of them are common in the developing world. A lot of the time when conversations there are about smart cities, it's actually about much more basic infrastructure and technology. I mean, there it can often be about sort of just more direct data collection or data management. I've seen sort of technologies, some of the smart city discussions there are even less about sort of direct digital technologies themselves. And it's certainly not always the types of things that you would see, branded in the United States in 2017 from Cisco about what a smart city in, San Diego might look like or something like that. So, it's interesting to think about the different applications and types of technology that we have. And, I was talking to some in a discussion this morning about how, on the one hand, here we often feel like we have too much technology and it's being thrown at us in all of these ways. And in a lot of the world, and certainly definitely parts of North America as well, there's just a basic lack of access to the internet, which the pandemic and everyone having to work from home is making even worse. So, but I think sort of in this sort of emphasis on sort of context and really understanding the issues, I would probably refrain from wanting to give a more specific answer of applications of technologies in these settings, just because it's not one that I feel sort of qualified to sort of directly comment on in that specific way.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Nancy's asking, fascinating work. Thanks so much. I volunteer at the Women's Center of Calgary. Thinking about women's and girls' experiences of the city has been a key issue in the past few years, especially around safety. Can you think of ways that your ideas about technology could advance this work, or disability, racialized communities? And I'd imagine she would probably put an et cetera there as well.
Yeah. There's interesting, increasing discussions around. Well, actually, I think an interesting overlap here is, especially connecting to disability, is that increasingly discussions in technology are sort of taking up the mantle predominantly from disability rights of nothing about us without us, as a way of thinking about the role of the public and residents in having a role in shaping technology, not just related to issues that influence disability, but also other communities as well, sort of trying to assert that necessity for having a seat at the table, having a voice at being able to shape technology in all of these ways. And to me, sort of more broadly, these issues around disability and certainly around racial justice have long been sort of ignored in conversations around technology. And increasingly, to me, the key role of some of the future work is, and where this has to go, is in thinking much more directly about these types of communities and these types of issues, rather than taking a relatively universalist, sort of neutral view of just helping everyone and understanding what these problems are. And I think, this definitely comes to sort of also thinking about how technology is developed and created, where as a field, technology is very dominated by white men, and often, decisions about it are coming from political leadership, which has similar sort of demographic inequalities, and the technology companies. So also being able to, better even understand what these problems are and how technology is likely to affect different communities. We've seen that a lot in the pushback against something like facial recognition, which on one level seems to be, just sort of this, okay, it's an interesting technology, deep learning and neural networks make it possible, but you can't understand the use of facial recognition without understanding the particular context in which it's going to be deployed, which means, police using facial recognition to identify and track the public, which is going to have very significant, particularly harming for Black and other minoritized communities. And what's interesting is how even the debate around this has evolved, where several years ago, some computer scientists demonstrated that facial recognition and gender recognition algorithms were less accurate for women than men, and for people of darker skin tones than lighter skin tones. And initially, some of the response around this was, okay, well, let's just get more representative data sets and improve the accuracy of these facial recognition systems so that they can, be equally accurate for Black women as they are for white men. And stepping back a little bit further, we sort of have largely moved to a recognition that we don't actually want more accurate systems. What we actually want is to not have any facial recognition systems, because it's the real sort of racial injustice of these systems would not be about getting an erroneous identification by facial recognition, but by the ability of police to further advance their existing types of practices through this technology. So really thinking about how the technology is integrated into existing contexts, and that the meaning of that technology, and particularly its impacts on different groups of people, is going to be largely shaped by the types of policies and practices that it's being used for. And so we can't sort of escape these broader questions of political priority and power just by talking about technology.
I've heard some people describe it as what we need is not a more inclusive oppression.
Exactly. Yeah.
Adam, next question here. Adam is asking, would you conclude that cost efficiency is a positive outcome of smart enough cities where there would not be as much emphasis on expensive, high technology and AI methods of data collection, or would non-technology data collection and solution methods be just as costly?
I think that, to me, the cost efficiency directly is a little bit secondary, or sort of not really one of the concerns that's on my mind. And I can sort of draw the connection here, even though, as you point out, some of these large projects can be quite expensive and can involve significant amounts of money being thrown into these types of projects. But, sort of to parallel here with the discussions around defunding police departments, the goal is not, what people are talking about is not defunding police departments as a cost-cutting austerity measure to lower taxes, but as a redirection of funds to say that, that same amount of money, crazy billions amounts of dollars, at least in many of the cities in the United States, can be spent on education and services and all sorts of other things. And so the cost efficiency is sort of not the value in and of itself. And I would say that's the case here, where I think that having a debate about smart or smart enough cities in terms of cost could really go both ways. I mean, in some cases, there are these expensive projects that, run over in terms of cost. But in other cases, a lot of the smart city efforts are explicitly themselves about cost cutting, where the logic of these systems or software is about making the most efficient use of limited resources. And that's sort of the logic of public-private partnerships as well, such as a lot of the ones that Sidewalk Labs has been involved in around, not having to use government funding to pay for services, but rather letting the company do it. So to me, it's really a matter of, I actually think that, in terms of the broader vision, I think we should be okay with at least maybe more costs or different allocations of costs, where we shouldn't just be trying to sort of create these, follow these logics of cost cutting and public-private partnerships, which is a lot of what leads us into this direction, but be more open to other types of publicly funded and managed infrastructures for technology, so that if we want to have a public Wi-Fi network in the city, or we want to have contact tracing, as we're talking about now, or we want to have, micro mobility options for the city, that we actually don't have to rely on, VC-backed Silicon Valley companies, but we can manage and think about those technologies democratically, even if there might be a shifting of cost one way or another.
Yeah. And perfect timing. The last question, and probably the last one we have time for too. So good timing. And Byron Miller, who was on the earlier call as well, how are you defining democracy? Wanted to take us out. You have 9 minutes. While there are lots of examples of smart city projects that are concerning from a democratic governance perspective, are there any that you can point to as good examples of enhancing democracy? So there are a lot of projects that are concerning. Are there good examples?
Yeah, that's a great sort of place to think about. I think so. One, I would say that sort of thinking about technology or smart city projects around enhancing democracy, it gets a little tricky, in part because of some of the very sort of or anti-democratic tendencies of a lot of these projects. In the book, I talk about some platforms that are used in participatory budgeting, ways of opening up access to more people to better participate in those types of programs that are shifting some amount of direct public control over over budgets to the public, and how technology platforms can enhance that without becoming sort of the central element. Although, I'm unsure of sort of how far those types of applications or settings get us. What's interesting to me when thinking about this is that really the most important examples of enhancing democracy in relation to smart cities have really come more from a sort of public resistance or backlash type of response. So less of a smart city branded project that's about enhancing democracy in some way, it's much more of, people coming and saying, actually organizing to say, we don't want this type of surveillance. We don't want you using facial recognition. We don't want, sidewalk labs coming in to the city. And so I think, seeing those types of responses as indicative of democracy and indicative of people coming together to better deliberate when operating in these settings where, and this is, again, not just about technology, but all sorts of decision making around these types of projects, especially around real estate investments and urban planning decisions, and certainly around law enforcement, are generally quite undemocratic and quite hard for people to get into. And I think technology is in some ways allows people something more new and specific and tangible to latch onto in resistance. And so, I think but so this main challenge, and sort of I was pointing to a little bit around this discussion of crossroads for smart cities, is how can we move and actually develop projects that are smart city type, and again, moving away from that type of term, but urban technology efforts that are better at enhancing democracy without it being more of a confrontational, only happening on the outside. And I think that's sort of the significant challenge that we see. And even, I think, I'm working on a project with someone around how a particular agency can do more sort of participatory engagement around governance of data sharing for the efforts they might be doing. And you're going to get into the perennial question of what type of participation are they actually open to? Do they just want to have people come in so that they can get their consent and get some general feedback? Are they actually willing to afford some amount of decision-making power over to the public? And I think these sorts of tensions are going to come out quite a bit as we have more discussions about democratizing technology. But we also are then going to run into, as the effort in New York City ran into with the Automated Decision System Task Force, that as much as you might talk about democracy, a lot of the time the institutions actually don't really want to do that. And, the de Blasio administration, who ran for president as some great, progressive champion, that administration was incredibly obstructing of any of these forms of democratic participation or oversight. So that, you sort of raise in many ways the key question. So I sort of only have more questions and open thoughts as opposed to direct answers on that.
I really like how you've pointed to Sidewalk Labs in Toronto as being an example of enhanced democracy. It's funny, actually, in a conference call in between our two conversations today, I and the other two people on the call had said a very similar thing. Right. It might be a sign of enhanced democracy that the Smart City program failed, right?
Exactly.
It could actually be the main take-home point. So awesome. Well, we are just at time and just out of questions, and that's perfect. So, so Ben, thank you so much again for all the time you've given us today, and congratulations on your new tenure track job and getting the book out, and for answering these questions twice today. And I guess you've given us a lot to talk about and to think about in the group, and we'll be in touch if there are any other ways to collaborate in the future, which I hope there will be.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Ryan, for the gracious hosting and invitation. And I was really thrilled to be able to connect with you all throughout the day. I really appreciated all the thoughtful, really thought-provoking questions. So looking forward to future discussions, hopefully more in real life with faces as opposed to text boxes. So looking forward to many future opportunities for that as we move into a differently strange new world.
Absolutely, 100% agree. All right, thank you. And thank you all for attending. There were 38 at one point. And so that was it's a really good turnout. So thank you all for attending as well. And we'll see you later. Have a good weekend and talk to you later.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.